Welcome to Brain in a Vat. Today we have Nathan Nobis, who's the author of Thinking Critically About Abortion. And it's a wonderfully accessible book that provides arguments on both sides of the debate, which is freely available in the description below. Nathan, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
The main issue about abortion is whether fetuses are persons or not. So there's a big debate about whether fetuses are persons. Why is there such a debate? Well, because people think like, look, if something's a person, then it has the right to life. And if it has the right to life, then it's pretty much wrong to kill in most circumstances. And so that would mean if fetuses are persons, well, that would mean that abortion is pretty much wrong. Almost 50 years ago, the philosopher Judith Thomson, who recently passed away, had a thought experiment designed to challenge that simple, common argument. Imagine you wake up one day in the hospital, plugged in to a famous violinist who is using your kidneys to filter his or her blood. Now, you didn't agree to this. You didn't know that this was going to happen, and you're surprised about what's going on. And you're told, look, here's the situation. The violinists need to use your body to filter his blood. We've been trying to find somebody who can help, somebody whose blood type and biology will fit with his. And we found in the hospital records that you are the one match. So last night, we, the Society of Music Lovers, we kidnapped you and plugged you into the violinist. And, we're really sorry about this, but look, it's only 9 months. And if you unplug from him, you'll die. There's a couple questions that are good to ask people. What would you do if you wound up in such a bizarre circumstance? And second, what should you do? Those are, of course, different questions. What would you do? What should you do? And then a related question would be, if you unplug from the violinist, have you violated the violinist's right to life? So those are the questions. And Thompson's answers help us sort of reevaluate that simple argument about abortion.
So if I understand correctly, Thompson is saying that you can unplug if you're that person who wakes up next to the violinist, right? You're allowed to. It's okay. You're not forced to have the violinist live through your kidneys for the next 9 months. And so her conclusion is that just because someone is a person, the violinist is a person, and perhaps a really impressive person, a very accomplished person, does not necessarily mean that they have a right to your body.
Most people you ask, like, what would you do? They would say, I would unplug. I don't want to be plugged into this guy for 9 months. I didn't agree to this. I didn't want any of this happen. So I would unplug, and it would be permissible for me to unplug. I wouldn't be doing anything wrong in unplugging. I wouldn't be violating his rights. That means that the right to life is not a right to everything you need to live, which I think is part of the sort of mistaken assumptions behind that initial simple argument against abortion. The right to life does not include a right to other people's bodies, even if you need them to live.
So what's so clever about the case is that she can avoid questions around the personhood of a fetus. So she's trying to make out an analogous argument for why, even if it is the case that a fetus is a person or a full human being, that nonetheless there is some reason to think that you don't owe it an obligation. But there might be a couple of problems with the way that the case is set up. So imagine this. Imagine that I go out on the town with the violinist. And before we go out on the town, he says, listen, just so you know, I've got a serious kidney problem. And if we drink too many tequilas together, I might need to be hooked up to you for a period of 9 months. And just so you know, you are the only person who can do this for me. And I say, yeah, okay, cool, no problem, man. And we go out and we're having fun. And I just think, but tequila is so good. It's so much fun. I really want to do this with this violinist, And so I acknowledge the risk that there will be this problem that the violinist will have to be hooked up to me for this period of time. And I say, but yeah, I mean, maybe if he just drinks enough water, it'll be okay. And, he shoots up the tequilas, and at the end of it, he's got the renal failure and he has to get hooked up to me. in that situation, we start to say, well, hold on a second. You've got a bit of culpability in this. You made some choices. You knew there was a risk. You weren't just kidnapped in the middle of the night. And so I think that the way that Thompson sets up the case might only apply to certain kinds of cases where someone falls pregnant. So it seems to my mind most analogous to a rape case where someone played no role whatsoever in the choice. But our sympathy might change in the situation where we said, but hold on, you knew the risks. You knew that there could be a person who would, would require your, access to your resources to survive, but you took this sort of risky behavior anyway. And maybe there our sympathies change a bit.
Did this person say, yeah, I agree that I will, support you with my body for 9 months if needed? Is that?
Well, we can imagine two versions of it. So the one is an explicit agreement where, in other words, the violinist approaches me and says, look, if I go out with you and we have some tequilas, I'm going to need to use you for 9 months. And you say, I agree, no problem. That case, I think we're going to say, Valenti maxim kicks in, the fact that it's very onerous to have this violinist on you, if you rationally consented to that, you are doing something severely wrong if you renege on the agreement. You are killing this person despite your agreement. So the Valenti maxim is this idea that you cannot be harmed by something that you consent to. So you can't say, I've dealt an unfair hand by this harm that has occurred because I knew in advance and I agreed to it. So that's the one case. Okay. And you might think an analogy of that would be, let's say, someone who volunteers to be a surrogate mother and accepts a zygote. And then during the course of the pregnancy says, I know I agreed to this, but I'm out. I don't feel like doing this anymore. I know I signed on the dotted line, but actually being pregnant kind of sucks and I'm not up for it anymore. So that might be the analogy there. The other one is the risky case. In other words, where I knew that this was a possibility. I resigned myself to the fact I didn't take any mitigating risks. In other words, like I wasn't on birth control. I knew that this was a possibility of my conduct, but I did it anyway. And those things seem to play a role in whether we think we have obligations to the violinist.
If you, made an agreement with your partying violinist that you'll be there to serve him if need be. I think that definitely accounts for something in that situation. How is that actually similar to pregnancy or sex that might lead to pregnancy? You're certainly not making some sort of agreement with a non-existent potential person to do anything. So, if somebody were to say that just as if you were to agree with the violinist to help him if he needs it after partying with him, you have agreed to gestate anybody who happens to come about. Well, I don't know. That's a very sort of different sort of agreement in each case. And indeed, it's sort of really hard to see how there's really any kind of, or could be any kind of agreement there. Of course, you could sort of promise to do it or something like that, or it's some kind of agreement with yourself. But it's hard to see how you could have an agreement, a contract with a non-existent potential person. About the second one, about the risk, it's risky. This might happen. The violinist might need your help. It is true that Thompson, as she presented it, was basically, all right, let's assume for the sake of argument that fetuses are persons with the right to life and see where it goes. But at the end, she says something like, all along we've just been assuming that fetuses are persons from the moment of conception or something like that. And that's not true anyway. So nothing we have said applies to the actual world. She assumes that for her discussion, but I think I'm inclined to think that at least when we take this back to the real world, we shouldn't keep sticking with the assumption that zygotes and embryos and early fetuses are persons, in part because that makes a difference to how we should think about the case that you just mentioned. Your thought or your charge or whatever basically assumes that early fetuses are persons and that we are obligated, or women would be obligated to, carry them to term.
Yeah, so I think if we want to test out this intuition about, do we think that an early fetus or a zygote is the equivalent of, let's say, a newborn baby, use another thought experiment. So, for example, imagine that there is a doctor who's performing in vitros, and he's got a petri dish with one zygote in his hand, and on the other hand, he has a newborn baby. And as he's sort of walking down the hospital corridors, he slips. And you could say which one, you're okay with falling on the floor to its death. I would think that most people aren't going to say, well, it's a coin toss. They're going to say, well, I'd prefer it if the zygote dish falls on the floor instead of the newborn baby. And then we might test the case and say, okay, how many zygotes could we put into that dish before you would say, okay, I'm happy for the baby to die? And it might be quite a lot. It might be that there is no number even. It might be the idea that a newborn baby is just a different kind of being. So I think we can test those out. But also through our discussion, we're seeing that there's a limit on how far Thompson's case gets us, as you point out, because as soon as I start talking about, reaching an agreement with this being, you want to say, but hold on, it's disanalogous because the being isn't in existence. So in other words, the zygote, you'd say, is just different because it is not a person. But as soon as we make that move, then we have to start going into some of these other questions about, well, what is a person and what obligations do we owe people, and does a zygote count?
What is called sort of the autonomy argument is in kind of popular discussion of these topics, kind of presents sort of a simplistic version of Thompson's arguments, which is kind of like almost as if she's saying, look, you got a right to your body. You can do almost anything you want with your body because you have a right to it and nobody has a right to it. And that's really not quite what Thompson says. And so part of the reason is, like, not all obligations are due to rights. Well, suppose pregnancy was like super easy and super quick. Maybe you could think that even though fetuses don't have a right to anybody's body, or nobody has a right to anybody else's body, maybe you'd be obligated to be good Samaritans to them.
Suppose I'm listening to this argument, and before listening to this discussion, I have a very firm view on abortion, right? Suppose, for example, my view is against. So I think that it is absolutely wrong to abort. I can imagine a few arguments that I might raise. So one would rely on this notion of personhood, which perhaps multiple of these arguments would. But a personhood argument would say, well, fetuses are persons, and it is wrong to kill persons, and so it is wrong to abort. So Thompson is providing a counterexample to that argument. But suppose you don't really buy Thompson's example. Why exactly would you classify fetuses as persons or not as persons? What are the reasons for not classifying them as persons?
A lot of people, or at least some people, say something like this. Look, abortion is wrong because, if a woman has sex, she knows there's a chance that she could become pregnant, and that just makes abortion wrong. So that seems to ultimately lead to just like, well, look, if a woman gets pregnant, she's just obligated to remain pregnant. Abortion is wrong. So we're headed towards abortion is wrong basically because women are obligated to not have abortions, which is sort of just going in a circle. So one thing that's added into this mix is somebody might say, like, well, look, if a woman has sex, she might bring about somebody or something that is dependent on her. And if you create something that's dependent on you, well, you're obligated to support that being. And that to me seems a little also potentially question begging, insofar as it's like, well, what if you did something where you created like a plant that was dependent on you, or just a random blob of cells that was dependent upon you? Would you be obligated to, continue helping that plant? Or would it even be wrong to kill that plant or that blob of cells, even though you did something that created this thing that's now dependent upon you? And I mean, the answer to me seems to be no. It's just a blob of cells. And here I really mean like just a blob of cells, like you've done something that results in this patch of skin cells that is now in existence. Just because you create something that's dependent upon you doesn't mean you have obligations toward that sort of thing. I think a response to that, at least in kind of popular thinking, would be, well, but fetuses are different. And okay, they are different, but how are they different? Well, they're the kinds of things that you're obligated to help that if you bring them into existence.
Your concern is that it's question begging, right? That someone is arguing that it's wrong to abort because fetuses are the kind of things that are wrong to abort. There might be a different answer. So when you ask the question, why is a fetus different from a clump of skin cells? The answer might be because this clump of cells either constitutes a person or constitutes a potential person.
In the book, we propose 2 activities to kind of try to figure out what persons are. One of the activities, the second one, is basically make a list of persons and make a list of non-persons, and then kind of ask yourself, well, what do the persons have in common that makes them persons? What do the non-persons have or lack that makes them non-persons? And the subtle wrinkle, though, to this activity is, all right, in making that list of persons, you have to include beings that might not exist, but if they existed, we would call them persons because the concept of person fits. The list of non-persons is really easy, hopefully. You got your rocks, you got your carrots, you got your car tires, you got your, coffee cups, blah, blah, blah. That heart that's getting ready for transplant, not a person. Maybe go into a person, but not a person. And then on the list of persons, well, there's, people like us, but then you have to think about various science fiction characters that, human beings interact with, are friends with, blah, blah, blah. The potential for spiritual persons, divine persons, so on and so forth. And so you can make these lists and then sort of ask yourself, what's the sort of common denominator? And I think it comes down to kind of psychological features. You can also get to this from another way, which would be thinking about, all right, I'm a person, you're a person. What would end our personhood? When would we cease to be persons? Well, there's 2 routes you could go, something or nothing. And the somethings include, for most people, death. Many people think if they die, there will no longer be a person here. And another answer would be, well, if I were to fall into a permanent coma, that would end my personhood. On the other hand, some might say, some religious people might say, well, really, my personhood will never end. I'll keep on going, I guess, eternally, into the future in heaven or something like that. And so it seems like either of those options, I think, can take us to, well, personhood is like defined by psychological qualities. So persons are conscious, feeling beings with awareness, thoughts, emotions, stuff like that. So the way I often kind of simplify it is, well, persons are beings with personalities.
One of the useful distinctions you draw is between personhood and being a human being. So, for example, we can imagine a great ape that has personhood without being a human being. It can communicate, can communicate through sign language, can experience pain, might have some sort of desires for the future, but it's not a human being. So here seems to be the difficult case. If you want to say, well, look, a zygote doesn't have personhood. It doesn't have any of these sort of psychological features. What about a newborn baby? So a baby that pops out on the first day. It doesn't have any memories. It doesn't have any desires. Maybe it's got some capacity to experience physical pain, but we might think it doesn't have the capacity to suffer because it can't reflect on that pain. Is it a person? And if it's not a person, and we say, well, it's okay to kill non-persons, do you have to accept the view that infanticide follows from your restriction of which beings get rights?
No, not at all. It does not follow at all, because I set the bar pretty low. There are some people who say, oh, to be a person, you have to be self-conscious. You have to think about yourself. You have to, do lots of really fancy things. And my inclination, in part because of the chimpanzee examples and other sort of animal examples, would be that, no, the bar is set fairly low by sort of, basically being kind of merely conscious and feeling in a kind of psychologically unified sort of way that, at least on my experience with newborn babies, it seems to me that they meet it. Babies feel things, they perceive things sort of seem good to them, seem bad to them. They're not thinking about Descartes or anything, but most of us aren't.
Okay, so if I take your low threshold, it seems that there might be two other things that follow. The one is that if having personality affords you at least a right not to be killed, that we might think that extends to a series of animals. So you might think, for example, you can't kill pigs and lambs and calves. They all have personality and an ability to experience. The other one might be that.
And yeah, I agree with that. I think that my views about many things or about this sort of issue are pretty close to Tom Reagan's. He's the author of The Case for Animal Rights, where he basically proposed that anything that's what he calls a subject of a life, which is basically kind of a conscious feeling being, he proposes kind of a little bit more, but anything like that would sort of kind of have basic rights. And actually, this view is sort of updated or presented a different way more recently by Christine Korsgaard, where she proposes that any being that has a good for themselves, any being that there's a way for that being to be, would be an end in themselves. And so the deal with Kant is that Kant says, Kant basically says our good is being rational beings. Korsgaard argues that, Kant's mistake was not recognizing that animals have goods and they have a different good, which isn't being a rational being. It's being what they are, which is sort of a merely sentient being, or sort of more than that, a being that at the very least super fancy thoughts aren't really essentially associated with being that sort of being.
So then the next thing is we've talked thus far about early fetuses, so zygotes, things in early development. Is there a point in the development of the fetus where you want to say it is bad to do things to this being? In other words, it can experience pain. You can sort of imagine the sonogram where we can say, well, that thing it's got a beating heart. If we poke it with a needle, it tries to avoid it. We might think it has a personality. People might want to name it, before it has sort of exited the womb. So is there some juncture where you think that being gets a right to life?
That's my inclination. There could be some morally wrong abortions later in pregnancy. It does seem that fetuses become conscious. They do develop the capacity for feeling pain. Fortunately, this is well past when most abortions occur. A quick review of the medical literature suggests that, at least later fetuses seemingly are conscious and can feel pain. And at the very least, a view like mine says, that matters. So, at that point, or at that stage, or later abortions would become a much more morally serious matter. Some people are sort of upset with a view like that. they want a view that says like, no, darn it, any abortion for any reason in any circumstance would just have to be okay. It could never be wrong. And at least my reaction is like, well, why? I mean, it seems like some later abortions could be wrong. That doesn't mean that in these circumstances there aren't sort of other considerations that would overall justify an abortion.
So I think there's something very fishy going on here with your definition of personhood. And Mark will nod along because he's pro-animal rights. But okay, so the problem I have is that your definition of personhood is overly inclusive. Now, right at the beginning, you said, okay, let's come up with an account of personhood by listing those things that we commonly apply the word person to, and listing those things that we generally do not apply the word person to. And you gave a third list as well, but this is at the basis of your conception. Now, I take it as uncontroversial that most people would say, not this is a pre-philosophical intuition, that animals are not persons. Now, my issue is not that you want to award rights to animals. That's okay. I mean, there might be independent reasons for awarding rights to animals, and one of those reasons would be, for example, that animals can feel pain. But you might not want to say that animals are persons. It's strange that doesn't roll off the tongue very well, that animals are persons, but they would satisfy your criterion. So I have a cat who's been very diligently watching me watch you in this episode, and he's waiting for the moment when I give him a little bit of attention, because he knows that the moment I do that, he can ask for food. And he's waiting, and he knows that I'm talking about him right now. That seems to be a greater level of awareness and coherence in experience than a newborn has, and than a late term fetus has. So surely that would meet your criteria for personhood, and yet it seems to me to be counterintuitive to call the cat a person. And I'd like to make 2 points. The one is this counterintuitiveness of calling my cat a person. But the second one is in some of the implications of that. So one of the implications is what Mark spelled out, this idea of certain rights. Okay. I don't think those are counterintuitive. I think you can have animal rights. But here's a more counterintuitive notion. So suppose my cat gets quite sick, not sick enough that he's going to die, but sick enough that his quality of life is reduced and he's in pain. We wouldn't think it's untoward. We might even think it's humane and the right thing to do to put my cat down. But suppose a human went through the same. Suppose a human was fairly sick, was in pain, quality of life is reduced, but not terminal, not a case of cancer, just in pain. There would be something untoward, not necessarily in euthanasia, but in euthanasia without asking the person what they think. So you just decide one day, I think the quality of your life is not fantastic. I see you're depressed. I see you've got a backache, and this backache's not going to go away. And I've made a decision on your behalf that I'm going to put you down, just like I might put my cat down. We would think that there's something very bizarre going on there, right? We would think there's something morally repugnant going on there.
Sure.
And why is that? Well, one answer why is because humans can sometimes be the kind of persons that animals can't be. And it just seems to me like your definition of personhood is overly inclusive, and it generates all of these problems.
There are human beings for whom, like, look, they can't communicate what they want or would want if they were able to communicate. And so somebody else is going to have to decide what seems to be best for them, and make the decision on their behalf, which is kind of like what you're mentioning with your cat. If I made it seem like, at least I think that, look, everything is either a person or not a person, I don't know about that. It does seem to me like some things are sort of, more person-like than not. Is your cat more like a person or more like a non-person? Is your cat more like you or more like a rock? And, this sort of more like relation or whatever is a vague one, but, I think people understand what you mean. And well, my cat was really kind of more like me. So your cat is sort of person-like. Other people sort of propose like there's sort of, I don't know, degrees of personhood or levels or something like that. Maybe you, your cat, and a newborn baby, maybe they're all persons, but sort of different levels of persons or something like that, or different degrees or different kinds of persons or something like that. I don't know if you have children. I don't know what your experience with babies are, but a lot of people sort of say like, well, at whatever months, it seems like they're turning into more of like a real person. They're sort of more responsive in various ways. Whereas before they were more kind of just kind of blobby, cute and blobby. Something's happened and they seem more person-like.
On your view, there's this vague notion of personhood. So something could be one level of a person or another level of a person or one degree of a person or person-like and to different degrees of person-likeness. That is very unsatisfying to me as a philosopher and as a human, especially in notions when we start discussing notions like abortion. I want a yes or no, in any given case, not necessarily for all abortions, but for any given case, is this a person or not? And so is it right or wrong to kill it? And it sounds like an account like that is just not going to cut it, right? It's going to be very vague. Also, this notion of degrees or levels of personhood is not going to map onto the absoluteness of right or wrong. And it doesn't seem to me like it's even going to map onto degrees of right or wrong. I'm going to propose an alternative, right? So here's the alternative: is a very simple account with a very simple answer, right? So simple account is a Kantian account of persons. So a person is a rational being, or if you want to be sort of a neo-Kantian, a person is a being that has potential rationality. And if something is a person, then it is wrong to treat it as merely as a means to an end. And if it is not a person, then go ahead. It solves the animal case problem. Why? Because we just say animals have no rights whatsoever, which I'm totally fine with, but they can still experience pleasure and pain. And so we might accord some rightness and wrongness if you're utilitarian according to pleasure and pain, but they have no rights. And then we look at fetuses and we say, well, at a certain point in time, we say that the fetus develops the potential for rationality. Why? Because from that certain point in its development, it could be removed from the womb and survive without womb-like apparatus to keep it alive. So after a certain point in time, it is now a viable fetus. And so if you abort it at that point in time and kill it, then you are doing something wrong because it has potential rationality on this neo-Kantian view. But before that, it doesn't have potential rationality because if you were to remove it from the womb, it's not viable. It won't develop into a rational being. And so very clear-cut answer, very clear-cut account with a very simple solution. And it gets rid of the animal problem, the animal counterexamples, which are difficult for your account. My issue is not that you're saying that animals have rights. My issue is that you're saying that animals are persons. Why? Yeah. Why are you saying that? Well, because you're saying that the sufficient condition for personhood is a minimal coherence in one's experience, which animals clearly have. And once you start saying that animals are persons, you run into all sorts of problems. So then you stepped back from that and said, well, animals are not persons exactly. They're person-like. They're more person-like than they're rock-like. And that's where I start to say, okay, this sounds very vague to me, very fluffy. Kant has a much better account of what a person is, and
Mm-hmm.
it results in abortions being wrong after a certain point during the pregnancy and fine before that, which is exactly the result. That's the conclusion that you come to. That's the conclusion you want. So it just seems to me like the Kantian notion of persons works perfectly well in the abortion case, and avoids this counterintuitive implication that you have that animals are persons.
You know, it does seem plausible to me that if something is a rational being, then it would be a person. I have doubts about your move to potential for a number of reasons. One would be that, all right, you're sort of proposing that being a rational being kind of gives you rights. And so if you're a potentially rational being, you have those same rights. But of course, in general, potentially being something does not seem to give you the properties that come with being that sort of thing. So, standard example, if you're a lawyer, you've got the right to file a lawsuit or whatever. Random person shows up at court, they might say, sorry, you don't have the proper credentials, you can't file. If this person says like, well, but I'm a potential lawyer, and lawyers have the right to file lawsuits. Well, sorry, being a potential lawyer doesn't give you the right to do what actual lawyers get to do. You were saying like at some point in pregnancy, a fetus would gain this potential. It sounded like you were thinking that potential would come about later in pregnancy, but really, wouldn't it be there like from the very beginning? Embryos, early fetuses have the potential for being rational beings. Actually, that they're the kind of beings that are rational beings. So that seems to be their more preferred language, not potential, but they're like their essence is of a rational being. Upon closer examination, which you initially said that would make later abortions problematic, early abortions not problematic, I think people might think, well, your view results in most abortions being morally problematic, if not outright wrong.
If what you're checking for is actual rationality, then I think you can't really protect the newborn because it's not rational. You might be allowed to have infanticide up to 2 years, and if what you care about is potential, then I think you go all the way back down to the zygote, so it doesn't get to the same outcome as you. The other concern that Jason has, and he tends to have this kind of concern generally, is doesn't like vague categories. Now, I think that we wind up with vague categories all the time. So the classic sort of Sorites paradox is I have one grain of sand, and then I keep adding grains of sand to it. At some point, it becomes a heap of sand. But you can't tell me when it becomes a heap. And I think that there's something to be said for this with regards to personhood. So, for example, I can't tell you the exact day that my child becomes a person. He merges towards it. Similarly, we might think at the tail end of your life that if you have something like dementia, that before you reach a physical death, your personality is eroded, one sort of day at a time through the loss of your memories and of your sort of ability to reflect on your own life, and you might cease to become a person, but I can't tell you exactly when. So I'm quite fond of your account of thinking about personality as emerging or degrading. Let's assume for the sake of argument that these sort of non-person fetuses don't have rights. I want to give you some cases where I think it might nonetheless be wrong to terminate their physical existence. So here's the first case. Your wife is pregnant, and let's say at a point in time while it's still an early fetus, and I slip something into her drink, which then causes a miscarriage. Okay, what have I done wrong? If you think I haven't wronged the fetus because it doesn't have any rights, then why have I wronged your wife? The second case is imagine someone that deliberately gets pregnant, to then perform miscarriages to sell the product online. So that's it. She says, well, I've got all these customers who really like eating my miscarriages, and I make a living out of this. And so what I do is, or producing into artworks or whatever it is that she wants to do with it. So she says, I deliberately get pregnant every month, and just before the point of it reaching personhood, I then, take the abortive procedure, and I then sell this thing on the open market. In both cases, I think our intuitions are that something bad has occurred or something wrong has happened. I want to know how you would sort of make sense of that.
Where somebody is slipping something in the woman's drink to cause a miscarriage. Part of the story is that she wants to be pregnant. She wants to have a baby. She's going to have at least that baby only if that fetus continues to exist. So at the very least, that fetus has a sort of is instrumentally valuable towards a major kind of life goal and plan for her and other people who care for her. What the person does there could be or would be wrong for that reason. I guess what's important to notice is explaining the wrongness there. Well, you don't really have to appeal to like a wronged fetus, or really even, there's kind of like a wronged future person, but I think the more natural explanation is, these people, the people are missing out on their profound hopes and dreams for the future with this new person. About the second one, the person who's deliberately getting pregnant so that she can have miscarriages and sell them to people who want to eat them or whatever, that would be kind of harder to explain ultimately on a view like mine. I don't know, maybe there's a type of sort of callousness or vice involved. I don't know. I'm not sure what to say about that. It might be another sort of case where, it's just sort of very unfamiliar and very strange, and we have a hard time thinking straight about it because sort of our thoughts about it are cloudy.
The problem with Mark's case is that it's not that unusual. Of course, it is unusual for people to have abortions for fun, but I can imagine people having children for the wrong reason, and then deciding it's a bad idea. And I'm not saying that happens usually, but I'm saying that can't be an impossible case. I'm sure that happens more than very, very rarely. And those are going to, Mark's case is a very vivid example of that, a very visceral example of that, but seems to come to boil down to the same problem, is that someone decides, I'm going to have a child, and then they regret it and they have an abortion. That seems like there is something wrong that can't be cashed out purely in terms of the person's feelings and thoughts. It has something to do with someone being wronged, even though that someone is pre the point where you would consider them a person.
If we could create babies that were born without heads, we could create these babies and use them for organs. And I think that seems sort of similar in certain ways to this case. And then the reaction, the argument is that, and that would be terrible, that would be horrible. And so a view such as mine must be wrong. And at least my reaction to that, which maybe I should transfer to Mark's case, is that I think what you're picturing with these like headless babies is something like sinister and nefarious, and it wouldn't really have to be like that. So maybe I think your judgments are kind of or many people's judgments are kind of clouded by misimagining the situation. I feel like I'm going through some sort of stages right now of processing this sort of initial shock, and then mulling through it and like, well, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be that crazy or bad or whatever. So I don't know.
So here's a very simple explanation for why it's fine to have headless babies, but not fine to do what Mark is suggesting, and that is that the headless babies have no potential for rationality, but the 1 day pre-viable fetus does, and so we think there's something very wrong with aborting that so you can eat it and share it with your friends. But not an equally wrong thing to having babies that are headless. I just want to respond to this issue of vagueness. So Mark is right. I don't like vague categories. So when we want to know whether it's right or wrong to do something, then vagueness is a problem. But it's not a problem when you're talking about heaps versus piles. Or, how many stones do you need to make a heap? Well, it's vague, and that's fine because it has no implications. But when we want to know whether your daughter's life has value, that's, vagueness is not really helpful there.
Sure.
Basically, what I'm trying to say is that vagueness is fine when it's just a metaphysical issue, but when it has moral implications, that's when vagueness is not okay. We would much prefer an account that doesn't involve vagueness, and so we should accept, at least for that reason, perhaps not on the balance of reasons, but at least for that reason, that the fact that the Kantian account is not vague provides an advantage over your account.
Yeah, I suppose vagueness is a problem. We prefer that if everybody be either tall or not tall. If we could define tall so that everybody's either tall or not tall, that would be preferable to it being that there's some people that were like, I don't know if they're tall, I don't know if they're not tall. In this case, though, it seems like vagueness sort of better fits the facts.
I'm not so sure. I think the problem with the vague account is that it hits up against all of Mark's counterexamples. And the non-vague account doesn't suffer from those counterexamples. It may suffer from others, but not those. Also, think about the tall case. The reason why it's a non-issue, whether there's vagueness around tallness, is because tallness doesn't really, our moral intuitions around things don't rest on tallness. We don't think, for example, that we can kill people who aren't tall and allow people who are tall to live and must. If that was the case, if we had a society based around tallness giving you a right to life and personhood, well, then we would definitely want a non-vague account of tallness.
That's perhaps why my proposal isn't vague. Since I think I'm proposing that if you meet some minimal threshold, you're in the ball game, so to speak.
So I think what's interesting about your account is you probably could identify within a short period of time a point at which it becomes wrong to abort a fetus. So if you say at the juncture where it can experience pain or has what we call personality, at that point it becomes wrong, and you're going to take the view that it's at some point in that fetal development. Maybe there's some debate about how many weeks in, but you can point to a period of time. So as you say, you may have maybe vague cases, but you're going to pin yourself down to some particular point in time. Here's an interesting situation. So some of our viewers will have watched an episode we did with David Benatar on the meaning of life, and David Benatar is very famous for his views on antinatalism. So he takes the view that it is better never to have been born. And one of the implications of this view is what he calls the pro-death view. So the idea that is, if it's better never to have been born, there is some point in time when you pop into moral existence. So very much in line with the view that you've expressed, that you start off, let's say, as a zygote, as a non-person, and at some point in time in the womb, you then pop into moral existence, and it would now be wrong to abort you. And there is a eunice that's emerged. So his view is that before that happens, a mother has a moral obligation to have an abortion, because it would be better for that being not to exist, and that you have done something wrong by falling pregnant and giving birth to a child, and you have done something wrong by not ending a pregnancy at a certain stage.
We are like essentially conscious and feeling beings. So you wouldn't exist until later when that starts. So, that wouldn't be you. So, but of course, if, as Benatar suggests, if that embryo or fetus were killed, well, that would prevent the person from coming into existence, which would prevent them from prevent something very bad.
Yeah, so it's a counter to the kind of usual line, which is that life is worth living and that you are depriving a being of a good life. In other words, he's taking potential into account. He's saying no, potential does matter. It is the case that life is nasty, British, and short, and it'd be much better if you never had one. And therefore, there is this moral obligation to prevent the potential of that occurring. And as you say, there's, let's say, this prior event, which is not a you, which will lead to a you coming into existence. And if you can stop the event from taking place, well, then you ought to do so.
Does he say advocate for, I don't know, kind of like widespread vasectomies or anything like that?
So his position is that the best case for humanity itself is if we cease to exist. So in other words, the best scenario would be if everybody stopped producing children, not for the sake of the earth or nature or anything, but for those children, because for them it would be bad to exist. So yeah, widespread sterilization would be something that he thinks would be good. He doesn't advocate for forcible sterilization. So he thinks it would be better for people to make that choice themselves, to either choose to become sterile or just choose not to procreate.
Forcing people to do that might make this existence even a little bit worse.
Yeah, it's an interesting tension in the view because partly you have all these successive generations that will have to bear the burden of existence, and you might think that the wrong of violating someone's bodily integrity by forcibly sterilizing them is minor in comparison. When pressed on it, he's sort of said to me that, well, maybe I'm wrong, and that you should sort of abide by a first do no harm principle.